All right. And I think we'll get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Roberta. For those of you who are not familiar with the work of the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We were founded in 2023, and our mission is really to build and strengthen a healthier internet for Latino communities and Latin Americans. And we do that through three pillars of work: research, capacity building, and policy. And in the research arm of what we do, we usually do a lot of behavioral science research, public opinion, uh, focus groups, interviews, work. And we also do a lot of narrative analysis on social media and in over 2,000 and now 400 public WhatsApp groups of Spanish speakers. And all of those groups have at least 30% numbers based in the United States. If you're interested in getting some of that research later, we can talk through it. Dunny will share a link for you to sign up. So why are we here today? I am here with two of our wonderful research consultants, Cristina Tardaguila and Marcelo Suarez. They were the two that led this work that we will be sharing out today. And what we're doing is we're launching brand new findings on a deep dive that we did into the Community Notes program of X. Our team downloaded all of the public data that X had put out on its website about Community Notes from 2021, when the program first started, to 2025, March specifically of this year. And we looked at a bunch of different things. I'll tell you what we looked at in just a second. Kitty's next slide, please. Why did we choose to do this? We did it because recently, especially in the last few months, a lot of social media companies have started migrating over to using the community-driven moderation model for taking care of the health of their platforms, for moderating false, misleading, harmful content. And as companies like Meta, which launched their program early this year, and TikTok, which launched its Footnotes program a few months ago, start implementing these community-driven tools, we wanted to be able to offer data-driven insights about what might have been working in the X Community Notes space, which was really the foundation for this type of approach, what could potentially be improved, and what the real potential is of this type of work and this type of model for actually ushering in a healthier information ecosystem inside of these platforms. Um, Thank you, Chris. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the scope of this project. The caveat being, we are really hoping that this will be one of one or two more studies that we do on community notes. I'll tell you why in just a second. So I mentioned earlier that our team downloaded the public data set. The data set included 4 buckets of information or data. It included 1.76 million notes, individual annotations on posts. It included the note status history, which is essentially information about the progression of each submitted note through X's system. It included the ratings on that note and on those notes, and I'll tell you what that means in a second, but over 276 million ratings. And it included user enrollment information. And by user enrollment, I mean the enrollment of the contributors to the Community Notes program, specifically their enrollment dates and their activity. And we'll talk about the behavior that we were able to analyze based on that. So what we focused on are 3 things. Before I talk about the life cycle of Community Note, I just want to do this. So the first is the structure of the public data set itself. So the limitations of the system, what's included, what's not included, what could be better, participation dynamics of the Community Notes contributors, differences between English and Spanish notes, and then the behavior of the top contributors as well. What this does not include, unfortunately, but we hope to include it in the 2 or 3 other studies that we do, is it doesn't include a deep dive into the content of the community notes themselves. And it doesn't include a deep dive into the content of the X posts that the notes were affiliated with. And the reason for that is Twitter's X removed access to its API for free a few years ago. And so access to the X API is really expensive because we're such a small startup. We don't have access to the API. We hope to, with partnerships or funding, be able to dig deeper into that. But regardless, today we'll let you know a lot about the operation mechanisms and trends. Okay, Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. So I think a lot of you might be familiar with this, but just in case you aren't, a quick overview of how the Community Notes programs works to begin with. So um, what is this? So users, Community Notes contributors, submit notes of context or correction to specific X posts that might be false or misleading or might need more information. And what happens when they do that? The note goes into the X internal system and it goes through an approval process per se. So the notes go through a submission. They require that other contributors rate that note, specifically rate the usefulness or not usefulness of that note. They all have to come to what is called a consensus around this. It's not clear exactly what that means. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And the contributors themselves have to represent a diversity of perspectives. Again, X does not make it super clear exactly what that means. How much diversity, diversity in what ways, etc. So the notes go through this process, and the potential outcomes of that process are the four that are outlined here. So option one, notes submitted, the contributors rate it, they come to a consensus, it's really helpful, great. It's rated as helpful, it goes live and is posted onto the tweet or X post that it was affiliated with. Option two, the notes submitted, the contributors rate it, they all agree it's not helpful. Then it's not helpful, okay, it's not published. Third option, new note is submitted, the contributors rate it. There's no consensus. And again, we don't really know what that means, right? Is consensus 50% agreement? Is it 60%? Is it 70? We have no idea. No consensus is reached. It's rated as needs more rating. And then people continue to rate it as it goes through until they reach consensus or not. And then the fourth option is really that a note is submitted and it never gets rated. And we'll talk a lot about that later. If it does not get rated, it could mean that it doesn't get seen. It could just mean that people saw it and they didn't rate it a specific way. The note goes into limbo. If it doesn't get rated, it didn't even start the process. It sits there. We don't really know what happens to it. Next slide, please, Chris. Okay, so I'm going to go through our key findings in 4 or 5 different areas. The first is about the data set itself, then about the notes that were submitted, then about the notes that were published, submitted and published, then some takeaways about the unrated notes that I mentioned go into limbo, and then some takeaways around the top contributors and the content of the top contributors. We'll wrap up with some really solid recommendations that we hope tech companies, social media companies will keep in mind as they're improving the system if they choose to go with it, and that we hope policymakers and users will keep in mind as well. Okay, so first key findings about the data set. The data set is massive. So Marcelo can attest to this. We downloaded everything from 2021 to 25. And we were lucky that Marcelo is so talented. He has the technical skills. He has the tools to be able to analyze this stuff because the data is in bulk and it's huge. So if you go into our website and you read the reports methodology section, you'll get all of the insights into what we did here. But essentially, Marcelo used Google BigQuery to analyze this. Excel was not enough for it. And because there's a lot of public data missing from the public data set, for example, there's no information about language breakdowns. We inferred that. I'll tell you how in a minute. So no language breakdowns, no information about the demographics of the contributors, no real information about the location of the accounts contributing. So the data set's there. That's great. Not a lot of companies put that out there, but it's really hard to manage and it requires a lot of time and technical expertise. Next slide, please, Chris. So going into the notes submitted. So as I mentioned, since 2021, when this program opened, 1.7 million notes have been submitted into the program. And what we did was we looked at all of that and we saw that the majority, the most used language for community notes is English. And we inferred language use using a Python program that Marcelo used. Again, it's outlined in the methodology section, but if you have questions about it, at the end, we'll open up to Q&A and he can go in deep and we can all nerd out about that. And I learned a lot from it myself. But we saw that around 63% of the notes submitted were in English and only about 9.3% were in Spanish. But Spanish was the second most used language, and it was followed by Japanese, by Portuguese, and some others. Now, That said, we can't see, and this is important, because I mentioned there's no public data available about geography, we can't see where the English or the Spanish comes from, like what countries it comes from. So this is a global study. It's English globally and Spanish globally. Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. We've seen that submissions have climbed over the years. The program for the first 2 years of its existence was English only. So from 2021 to end of 2022, beginning of 2023, only English language contributions could be made. Then at the end of 22, beginning of 23, X opened that up for Spanish language globally. And so it's not surprising then that the majority of the submissions are in English, but what we've seen is English submissions have climbed steadily over the years, whereas Spanish submissions really spiked when they first opened access to Spanish language and non-English languages. And then it sort of plateaued, and now the monthly contributions for Spanish language community notes kind of range between around 8,000 and 11,000 notes per month, whereas the English language submissions continue to steadily climb over time. Next slide, please, Chris. The number of contributors is also growing. So you'll see this in our report, and we'll go over this a little bit later, but there were over 126,000 contributors in 2024 that offered up submissions in English. That number was a lot smaller in Spanish. But they are both growing year over year and nearly doubled from 2023 to 2024. And if the first 3 months of this year are any indication, we're likely to see that continue to be the case. Now, important here is you'd think that a higher number of contributors may achieve a higher number of publication success on their community notes. That's not really the case. We'll go through more on that later, but what we saw was that even though contributor participation is expanding both in numbers and in degree of participation, some bottlenecks, especially in English, are starting to emerge. So there are tons of notes going in. Some of them are getting reviewed and published. A lot of them are just sitting in the system in limbo, as I mentioned earlier, or otherwise. And we have the specific breakdowns of that percentage. Next slide, please, Chris. All right, so moving into the notes that were published. So these are the notes that went through the process, they reached the consensus, they were posted, they're live on X posts. So what we saw was that in 2024, of all the notes submitted, only around 7% of the English language submissions were published, and only around 4.7% of the Spanish language submissions were published. So very low publication success rates. Usually because the notes fail to reach consensus, but there could be other factors as well that we don't have insight into. There were some interesting trends. So in English, the publication rate was around like 9.5% in 2023. That dropped in 2024. In Spanish, it was around 3.6 and it climbed to 7.1. And so in 2025. And so I think by the end of this year, we'll be able to see how 2025 fully performed. But from what we can see, still very low degrees of publication on the giant level or giant volume of contributions that are being made. Next slide, please. Now, this is an interesting finding. I don't think that anybody else has this out there. So we were able to tell how long it usually on average takes a community note to go from submission to publication in English and Spanish. And that average in 2025 was 14 days. That is a lot better than it was in 2022. So in 2022, it would take a note more than 100 days to go from submission to publication. Obviously, 14 days, that's much, much better than it was in 2022. But as we know, as everybody in this room knows, if they were working on countering online harms, that's still too slow to be able to address the virality of bad or harmful content on the platforms. So clearly, and we'll go through this in the recommendations, like this is an approach to content moderation. It cannot be the main approach or the only approach because it's too slow to meet the demands of viral content on these platforms and on the internet writ large. Next slide, please, Chris. Something here that I think is important for us to recognize is that in Spanish, consensus is going up. The success rate of Spanish publications is stable. It's actually decreasing in English. And so, as I mentioned, lots of notes coming in, very few being published, and we'll see where that goes from here. Next slide, please. All right, now about the unrated notes. We talked about those notes that never get consensus at all, or actually never get seen or rated at all. And we were able to see that 17% of all English submissions and 15% of all Spanish submissions this year in the first 3 months never were rated. So it could mean they weren't seen, but it could mean they were seen and not actioned on. That was compared to 8% of English in 2025, or in 2024, excuse me, and 37% in Spanish in 2024. So things are looking up for Spanish. The percentage of unrated notes is going down. But in English, it's going up. And that's where we kind of drew that conclusion on the bottleneck from that we can talk more about in the recommendation section. All right, Chris, next slide, please. This is how you see the breakdown. Oh, sorry, you can go back one. This is sort of the breakdown between the rates that we mentioned. So notes get rated as helpful and they're published. As not helpful, they're not published. Needs more ratings as they're still being rated and evaluated and haven't reached consensus yet. And no status, they're not rated. And you can see where the percentage of unrated compares to everything else year over year. And again, we go more into detail of this in the report itself. Next slide, please. When it comes to the unrated notes, we really don't have insight into what happens to them when they're in limbo. And there doesn't seem to be a system inside of X to manage or retire, archive the notes that never get reviewed. And so that raises some concerns for us. There's no way for us to really offer accountability or insight. No way to tell how fair the system is, how efficient the system is. And so we have some recommendations around that as well. But yeah, so that's a high percentage of notes that never get rated. Lots of work being put in by the contributors for nothing if other contributors are not seeing or actioning again on these notes. Next slide, please. Okay, so top contributors. So as I mentioned earlier, because we don't have access to X's API, we were limited in our ability to offer large-scale content analysis on the note and on the tweets related to the notes. But Marcelo and Chris and Dani went in and they looked at the behaviors and the content of the top 10 contributors in the community note system in English and in Spanish. And they did manually go through and look at those notes contents. So even though we're mostly focusing on behavior here, there was some insight into this. What we found was that the most prolific, and Chris, you can go to the next slide, please. And here you can see how it breaks down about the top 10 contributors in English, the top 10 in Spanish. And then next slide, please, Chris. Actually, you can go back one. There's one thing I want to add here. Thank you. So we were able to see the content from the top contributor in English and the top contributor in Spanish. And what we found was actually that the most prolific contributor in English seems to be, interestingly, a bot or a bot-like account. It submitted 43,000 notes between 2021 and 2025, very geared toward countering cryptocurrency scams. So we could say it's a good bot, maybe. And the Indicator, our friends at the Indicator reported on this account a while back, and we were able to validate that really in English, the top account seems to be this one. But even though this account, which is bot-like or a bot, can submit lots of notes, more than anybody else, it still only reached 3% publication rate on its notes. So only 3% of the 43,000 notes that it submitted were published. So they were either unseen or didn't gain consensus. In Spanish, the top contributor submitted far fewer notes. So it submitted 913 notes compared to 43,000 notes in English. And it seems to contribute mostly to content related to Venezuela. So political misinformation or misleading information. The notes are very connected to Nicolas Maduro and other like dynamics related to Venezuela. And its publication rate is 10%, 10.7%. So compared to the bot-like account, which submitted 43,000 notes, it got 3%, around 3% of its notes published. The Spanish language top account submitted 913 and it got about 10% of its notes published. So that's very interesting. And again, in the second iteration of this study, we really hope to be able to go into the content at scale, the content of all the notes and of the contributors in more depth. And if we're able to get access to the API subsequently in a third study, we would want to actually look at the tweets or the X posts themselves. Because right now, the way the system is set up, we get a hashed code and we would have to manually go through every single note to connect it to every single tweet. And that would be really, really almost impossible to do. But Marcelo is wonderful, and I'm sure he will figure out a way to do it for us in subsequent analyses. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just one massive slide with those takeaways that I mentioned. This is the most important stuff that we hope you will walk away with. Essentially, of 1.76 million notes that are submitted, that have been submitted in the program between 21 and 25, less than 10% are ever published in English and Spanish. The breakdown is in the other chart that we showed. The time it takes a note to go live or from submission to publication in 2025 is about 14 days. Used to be over 100 days. So that's great that it's improved, still really slow. Content goes viral in minutes, sometimes hours. And as we've seen, that has happened a lot this year already. So clearly, community notes can't really keep up with that virality if it takes it 14 days on average for a note to go from submission to publication. We talked about how this happens, so the diversity of perspectives and consensus dynamics. Participation in the Community Notes program. Anybody can participate in this program if they've been in the platform for over 6 months and have never violated terms of service, privacy, or rules for X. So any of you, if you've been on X for more than 6 months, I know Christina is one of the Community Notes contributors. You can submit to be approved. We don't know how long it takes to be approved, right? But you could be a part of this if you're interested. The bottlenecks are something that we think is really important to keep an eye on. So in English, there are clearly some bottlenecks starting to emerge between submission and publication. The percentages of publication going down, the degree of notes that are never rated, things like that. That's really bad. So like, as we know in psychology and other areas of study that are related, the more people are making a decision, the harder sometimes it can be for a decision to be reached. And that seems to be something that we're seeing here is like, it could be the case that the more contributors that are in this program, the harder it is for them to reach consensus. We don't know, that's a hypothesis, but that's something to keep in mind. Spanish-speaking contributors' notes have lower success rates of publication, even though we've seen an uptick in Spanish language notes and contributors. So overall, Spanish is still lagging behind English, which is not too surprising for those of us who've been doing research on English and Spanish language content online. And then the last key finding really is about those top contributors that I mentioned, which you can read more about in the report. Now going into recommendations, people's possibly favorite part. So we broke down recommendations into a few different categories. As we're going through this, I just want to say we will open up to Q&A in about 5 minutes, and you will have Marcelo and Christina with us for at least 15 minutes to answer your questions. So start thinking of them now. You can put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. So first set of recommendations, data transparency. So this is about the public data set itself. One, great that it's all there. Meta and TikTok don't make that available yet. If and when they do, we hope that they will make the public data more filterable, available for download in parts as well as in bulk, and ideally more navigable. So developing a system that allows researchers to search for specific notes based on time frames or content could be helpful for understanding trends and context of implementation. I'll talk about the search for language later as well. Next slide, please, Chris. Information sharing, second category. So to the extent that these platforms are basing their metrics of success for the program on things like consensus or diversity of perspective, These terms need to be a bit more clearly defined, and the information trends disclosed to community notes participants, researchers, and regulators. We were able to see that X uses different algorithms to assess consensus, but th those algorithms seem to change between nodes. So there's no way for us to tell whether they actually have parameters that are standard for approval of the different nodes between nodes. And so there's a lot of opaque uh, information there, and there's a lot of that we have a lot of questions about this. So, like, how much consensus is enough consensus? How many people need to come to an agreement? We saw, for example, that notes related to things like the score of a soccer game, those reach consensus pretty quickly and they go live. But notes related to more thorny issues, like maybe political misinformation, those might sit in the system for a lot longer. Is it the case that 10 people came to consensus on the soccer game score, but we require 100,000 to come to consensus on the political misinformation? We don't know. So that's something that should be more clearly defined. Um, we also recommend that even though we recognize that like sharing information about contributors themselves could be dangerous. It violates privacy. So we're not going there. We still think that there's a middle ground in which companies should disclose contributor demographic makeup, maybe geographic breakdowns of contributors, so that we can at least see from where people are participating and to what extent. Next slide, please. All right, language improvements. So something really simple that we think could work is language labels inside the public data set. So as I mentioned, Marcelo used a third tool, Python. Lang, I think he'll talk about it maybe if you ask him this question, um, to infer language use. And then our team went through and manually verified the languages. So we were able to do that at 99% accuracy. We were able to tell. And so this was a way for us to get at the breakdown between languages, but it would be great if the companies could actually offer language labels that allow us to study language use without needing to use these external tools. We also because we see that Spanish language notes have lower success rates, we recommend that companies do some thinking around how they can elevate notes made in languages other than English for the raters themselves to at least assure that people are seeing the notes that are getting unrated. And if notes have been unrated for a long time, making sure those notes are being circulated back so that people can see them again. And then we were thinking through this, at a minimum, we think the language labels should be applied to the top languages used around the world. Spanish is used by, I think, over 20 countries more. And it's the second most used language inside of the platform. So at the minimum, they should make the language labels available for the top 10 most used languages of their platforms and markets. Um, we'll see. That's kind of a hopeful thing, but next slide, please. Backlogs and bottlenecks. So we mentioned that we are seeing lots of notes going unrated and that we are also seeing higher contribution rates, but not necessarily higher publication rates. So developing a system for managing, merging, or archiving some of these unrated community notes could be interesting for Meta and TikTok to consider. I also think companies should consider how they can ensure that the notes are, again, put in front of contributors after the initial submission in some sort of cadence, because the contributors are putting in a lot of time and effort into doing some moderation. That is actually one of the biggest criticisms of this system in the policy world, is that it puts the onus of moderating a platform onto the user. We don't have infinite amounts of time to do this. It's not our job to do this. And so at the very least, for the people that are already contributing, the company's system should make sure that the notes are being seen. And next slide, please. Speed, one of the biggest issues, as we mentioned, average 14 days. From this perspective alone, companies need to recognize that community-driven moderation can't be the primary way that they're doing this, and it can't be the only way that they're moderating content. We also noticed that regular users of X can't see when a community note is originally submitted or approved for publication. So the note will just appear on the X post once it's gone through the system and reached consensus on helpfulness. That can be really misleading for a user, because you might think that something was sort of annotated immediately after it was posted when it really took a couple of weeks. We have no idea. So companies should really consider disclosing, I think, some of that information to the user, because part of this exercise is users applying critical thinking to posts and users applying their own resilience to determining what they should and shouldn't engage with. So that would be a helpful additional piece of information for people to have. Next slide, please. And then lastly, but not least, automation. So as we mentioned, the top account in English may have been a bot. Sure looked like a bot. It submitted a lot for a human being. To the extent that AI is getting more sophisticated, which we know that it is, and now to the extent that companies are actually considering actively using artificial intelligence in the content moderation process, companies really need to be thinking through guardrails for assuring that these tools, these Gen AI tools are being used responsibly, if at all, other AI tools are being used responsibly, that we know when a community note was made through AI. And so disclosing that at the very least is really important to do. I think we should have an entirely separate, much larger conversation about the use of artificial intelligence for community-driven content moderation, how that can look, what it would mean. And as we saw just yesterday from X, Grok has been trained in a specific type of way, in a very toxic type of way. And so what does that mean when a platform's AI offshoot is starting to do community-driven content moderation or annotating posts? Next slide, please. So before I wrap up and go into Q&A, I just wanted to just thank Christina, thank Marcelo, and thank Dani for their inputs and insights and expertise into making this project a reality. This was really one of the more interesting things that we've done this year. It was also one of the biggest things that we've done this year. And it's something that, as I mentioned, we hope to do a second iteration of and a third iteration of, to look at the content of the notes and the content of the actual posts. And so we hope to partner with some of you and with funders to be able to do that. I'm now going to just open up to Q&A. I saw that Dani posted the link to the report on the chat. If you all have any questions or want to talk more about this after the session as well, like, let's do it. But for now, I will just pass it on for Q&A. And Chris, can I ask that you stop sharing your screen, please? Thank you. If you all have questions, you can either raise your hand or post it in the chat, and we'll give you some time to think.
Roberta, there is actually a question in the Q&A
Perfect.
section from Jenny Liu. I don't know if you have access to it.
I see it. So Jenny said, I believe you mentioned that Japanese and Portuguese were the next most used languages for community notes after English and Spanish. I see Chris nodding. That is the case. Would you be able to share the full list of language breakdowns? We're interested in looking at Chinese and Vietnamese language notes, and our suspicion is that there really aren't that many. Chris and Marcelo, is that something we can answer?
I can jump in very quickly. Marcelo, while you take a look at the data, maybe you have that in hand. But what we can tell very briefly is that we detected 55 different languages in the program, which was actually quite interesting. Like 55 seems like a very big reach of the program. I was kind of happy seeing that there's contribution in so many languages. And yes, Japanese was the third one. Portuguese, my beautiful Portuguese, was the fourth one. But I think Marcelo will have the raw data of percentages per language. Not sure if he had time to open the spreadsheets and all. Marcelo, turning to you.
I'm taking a look here. Just give me some
And I imagine
couple of
it'll
minutes.
take us a little bit of time, Jenny. So
Yeah.
we'll loop back in just a second if others have any questions. And if for some reason we can't during the next few minutes, we'll send you a note. But thank you for that question. That's a great one. And I think that, ideally, so as you know, I'm Brazilian, Chris is Brazilian, Marcel is Brazilian. So we absolutely want to be looking at least Portuguese, if not other languages as well. And I think that the idea of this project for us was really that, like, other people would be able to replicate it, or that we would be able to work together to kind of draw more insight. So that's something that we would be really interested in doing. And we should be able to do it using that Enfer program that Marcelo used.
Yeah, just give me, let me
A lot of
see.
pressure. That's a lot of pressure on Marcelo.
Yeah,
Oh, they
That's okay.
just, Ryan, thank you. They just took Grok offline. Wow.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
there's English first, then Spanish, then Japanese, then Portuguese, French, German, Italian, um, Dutch, Polish, and Finnish.
Wow.
Do
Okay.
you
So not
Chinese?
surprising that the North America and Europe are dominating in this. Um,
Marcelo, she was asking about Chinese and Vietnamese,
Uh,
right?
yeah,
they must be, there
but
are
they're not, yeah,
53
they're not near the
languages.
top 10. Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah,
I think, Jenny, we'll get back to you on the rating. So like we should be able to actually pull together a list of all of them
yeah.
in order of most submissions. So I'll email you if you can drop your email in the chat, or send me an email.
And Roberta, if I may, I think, Jenny, if that's something that interests you, Marcelo does have the data. So somewhere in his computer, his BigQuery, the data, whatever it is in Chinese and Vietnamese, might be easy to reach. We will not understand what it means because we don't speak either language, but that can be something easy for you to do.
Yeah, we could potentially partner on that later. All right. So Ryan, yes, thank you for letting us know about Grok. We also saw that Linda Yacarino is going to be stepping down as CEO. So there was a lot of X updates today. Um, Madeline is asking, are there any ongoing efforts to figure out how X is defining consensus? That's a really good question. So not that I'm aware of. The one thing that we noticed, Marcelo might be able to speak to this as well, is that they're using different types of algorithms. So, Marcelo, do you remember if you were able to assess anything else about consensus and what it means? I think you're on mute. Oh, you were unmuted for 1 second, I saw.
There
There.
you go.
No. Can you unmute me?
No, you're
Yeah.
unmuted now. Yes, thank
I
you.
am. Yeah. Well, they have some a few different algorithms they use. They inform for each node which algorithm was used to calculate consensus, but I haven't found any kind of documentation on how to assess that. What we know is that they have different criteria for different posts. There might be a reason to use this or that algorithm, but so far I haven't looked into that yet.
Yeah.
And if I may also, I think this is the core question here, team. I was extremely worried about that insight. The fact that consensus, there is no consensus about what consensus means is a big issue in the program, right? So for a note to be published and to help people be better informed, consensus is needed. But here we're talking about several algorithms, several mathematics uh, being used in different
Yeah.
posts, in different notes, which means that who knows exactly what consensus mean is sitting inside that company with very little transparency. So I think that's the core. If I were an investigative journalist, I would dive into that like very big. Yeah, Gloria, I'm not sure if you understood this part. You say it's so confusing. Just imagine that for every row of the gigantic database that we have, every row is a note. And for every note we that went published that get a consensus, there is a algorithm attached to that row. So, but when you look at the columns of all algorithms, they are different from one row to the other, and you just can't tell the logic
Yeah.
between why do they apply this algorithm here and not there.
Yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
confusing is a good way to put it. And consistent. It
Yeah,
sounds like
yeah,
there's no like standard way to assess consensus and that they're different between different
yeah. Imagine you take an international flight and you get into the airport and you drop out of the airplane and you have different queues to join. Uh, in the airport, you have a clear indication of which queue you should go in. Well, if you're an European citizen, this is your queue. If you're a South American citizen, this is your queue. If you're an American citizen, this is your queue. in X, in the community notes, there are different queues in different speeds, probably, but we don't know who goes to which queue.
Great. Yeah, and we don't know. Like, it could be that they're dividing this up by issue. It could be that they're dividing it by, I don't know, like submission type or like what have you, but that's totally not a transparent thing there. So Yuru Lin is asking, and thank you, she said, they say really interesting, curious to have a sense of what kinds of topics the notes in Spanish mostly cover. Are political topics a big part of it or just a small slice? Great question. So I will let Marcelo and Cris answer this because we only looked at the content of the notes for the top 10 contributors between English and Spanish. And I only talked about the top English and top Spanish. So definitely for the top Spanish, political misinformation seems to dominate, but I don't know for the others. So Cris, Marcelo, anything you remember from that?
Yeah, that's our next big step.
Yeah.
We haven't looked so much into the content. We only looked at the content of those users that were more prominent, but we will look at for in last year. I think me and Cristina have gave a look in Brazilian notes to see some issues, and there were all kinds of things. Everything that people might be interested in, there might be a note about it. Taylor Swift is probably bigger than many other political issues in community notes, and celebrity stuff is big, and and probably Taylor Swift gets more polarized in the than many political subjects. So who knows? That's our next thing. The first thing to assess political issues is that we can't split by country yet. To assess what can be from one country, what can be about one country, will depend a lot of what words we will look at.
In the note itself.
And
So
that's
what topics are being discussed in the note?
yeah.
Roberta,
Yeah.
and Marcelo, I opened our raw data file here, and just to give you like a peek of the second most, it was a note on Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister. It was published, and the third was a doctored-looking document with the title Millet Resistance Manual, which leads us to like a very brief conclusion that the top three contributors, they all posted about politicians. So it was, either Maduro, Pedro Sanchez in Spain, or Milei in Argentina.
Yeah, but we'll know
Very
more soon. And ideally, we'd be able to look at it by country. But I think what we'll probably do is develop a methodology for segmenting keywords related to topics related to different countries. And we'll come back and like give an update on that. Okay, other question was, oh, Jenny Marcelo said there are probably less than 1,000 notes in Chinese and Vietnamese, but we'll actually look and let you know for sure. Francisca is asking if we've been able to evaluate the real impact of community notes once they become visible. Is there any evidence that they actually influence how a post is perceived or shared, or do most people ignore them? So we actually did not do any research on this, but I know that there are a lot of behavioral scientists that have. So I will actually do a little bit of digging after this, and we can get back to you with some interesting articles. I'm sure there have been at least like one or two. What I can say is that a few years ago, so back in 2018, when I worked for a foreign policy think tank, and we were working a bit with Facebook back then, they were experimenting with labels like this. And I remember they shared that they would mark pieces of content as false. And that had a very negative reaction for users because users got defensive. They thought that they were being told they were stupid for believing something. And so Facebook actually adapted the label to be a suggestion for an article or another piece of content the person should look at, so that it was more of like a nudge than a push. And so from a psychology perspective, I know that there are a lot of these types of things that over the years have been tried to kind of like make people feel less insulted or what have you. And actually, we've done focus groups with folks where we put videos explainer videos and other things in front of them. And what we've noticed is that people are not dumb. They can see when you're trying to influence their behavior or when you're trying to push a certain agenda, even if it's like an educational agenda, often they can see through that and they do kind of bristle and pull back a little bit because they don't want to be told what to do. And so actually, if you're interested in that, we have a pre-bunking guidebook with 14 best practices that we drew from those focus group studies. We can put it in the chat, but some of it gets to that type of like mentality there. Okay. Are there ongoing efforts to figure out how X is defining consensus? We addressed that. All right. Any other questions?
There is a follow-up question from Madeline.
Oh, is there a finite number of algorithms or is the algorithm unique for every single node? So I'm gonna say we don't know that answer yet, Madeline, because I don't think that we actually like went through all like the millions of nodes to look at that. I imagine they're not all unique. But Marcelo, do you know like just off the top of your head? If not, that's okay.
Marcelo, is it possible to know how many unique algorithms there are?
For determining consensus.
I don't have it
That's
on the top of my head, but I can find out.
Okay,
I
so
can,
we'll
that's
look into
that's
that.
such a good research question. That's a great
It
research
is.
yeah,
question.
I think that
Very
we can
journalistic.
we
Love
can
it.
actually
Love
that could be another follow-up we do eventually is like yeah, to the extent we don't know what consensus is or can't define it, is there at least groupings of consensus algorithms or something? All right. Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming. This was really a pleasure. I know we're about 5 minutes overdue. If you're interested in staying in touch with us, you can you can either send a note here. I've shared my info. My email is here. And we have two resources that go out every week. Every Wednesday, we send out a newsletter where we track breakout Spanish language narratives that are going viral in social media and in the 2,400 WhatsApp groups that we monitor that I mentioned. That goes out every Wednesday. So actually, there's one going out probably in the next hour or two. And then we definitely do like one-off studies. If people are interested in looking at what's going viral, specific issues. We're happy to look at that. Yeah, looking forward to staying in touch and to working with all of you. I hope you'll sign up for our newsletters and reach out to us for future partnerships. Have a great rest of your week. Talk soon.
thank you.
Everyone. Amazing to have you all here.